Oh, God. Oh, I can't believe it's time for another flipped video. You guys are going to get the best one yet. There's not going to be any animation. There's not going to be any music. It's just going to be me talking to you. Or not. We'll see. I don't know. Maybe we'll try that out. But what we are going to talk about is some things that might help you out when we talk about Japan and its expansionist policies in the 1930s. We'll find out. So, despite the massive death toll and the sheer magnitude of the confrontation, the Second Sino-Japanese War is often overlooked as part of the Second World War. This conflict is going to play a major role in deciding the victor of the ongoing Chinese Civil War that would transform China into the communist state that it is today. Okay, so today what we're going to be looking at are the causes and the course of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Hold on to your hats. To understand the precarious situation that led up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, it is important to mention the events of 19th century China. The century can be characterized as one of factionalism, lawlessness, foreign intervention by Western powers, and rising nationalist sentiments, which in 1911 culminated in the overthrow of the established Qing dynasty by the nationalist Republicans, or Kuomintang. This led to intense regionalism across China, as warlords took control of small territories that they ruled in their own name. By the 1920s, the spread of communism led to the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, which was suppressed by the Kuomintang leader Chiang Kai-shek, who subjugated influential warlords in order to secure his rule over China. Soon after, Chiang turned his attention to the Chinese Communists, igniting the Chinese Civil War in 1927. Japan, by contrast, had been relatively isolated for millennia. The island nation had developed a highly militaristic society, and this was intensified after the Emperor of Japan consolidated his power in what was known as the Meiji Restoration, with its population's adherence to warrior and feudal codes translating into a religious devotion to the emperor. These years of seclusion contributed to the development of a xenophobic mentality. The Japanese viewed their culture as the most sophisticated and civilized. This sense of national pride continued to inflate, despite increased influence of the West in matters of technology and trade throughout the 19th and 20th century. The combination of ultranationalism, a centralized state, and European technology allowed Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War to conquer Korea from the Chinese, whose administrative process and technology paled in comparison. The Japanese would continue to expand throughout the Pacific and onto the East Asian mainland. The requirements of both a large population and a large military began to strain the Japanese economy, causing ever deeper expansion into the Asian mainland. In September of 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which offered ample resources and living space. As justification, Japan cited the Mukden incident, in which elements of the Imperial Japanese Army detonated a small amount of dynamite at a section of the South Manchurian Railway, which had been granted to them in the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese then falsely accused China of sabotage. Despite receiving orders to keep the incident contained at a local level, the Japanese army proceeded to capture all of the cities along the South Manchuria Railway, and surprisingly, the Republic of China maintained a policy of non-resistance, although some Chinese warlords and generals tried to resist, but unsuccessfully. By February of 1932, Japan had control over all of Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, which interestingly was governed by the last emperor of China, the 26-year-old Po Yi. The Chinese appealed to the League of Nations in response, and after a year-long investigation, the League concluded that the invasion was unjustified, to which Japan simply left the League of Nations. Chiang Kai-shek was aware that the Japanese interests in China were not over, and so in 1936 he agreed to an alliance with the Communists, putting the Chinese Civil War on hold. Less than 1 year later, the Second Sino-Japanese War would break out in full, when on the 7th of July, Japanese troops conducted a military exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge in Wamping. This startled the Chinese garrison, who weren't warned in advance, and the resulting confusion, shots were exchanged, and after the skirmish ended, the Japanese noticed one of their men was missing. When the Chinese refused to allow them to search the city, the Japanese attacked. Japan began bombarding Wanping, and by the end of the month, had taken Beijing and the surrounding areas. The Japanese were initially content with the territory they'd taken in northern China and wanted to end the war quickly, but Chiang Kai-shek was not giving up any time. He decided to open up a second front at the city of Shanghai, storming the Japanese quarter of the city on the 13th of August. The fighting around the Shanghai area lasted for a total of 3 months, marked by intense close quarters combat. Shanghai finally fell when an amphibious Japanese force landed in the southern region of the city, which was left undefended. The Chinese took heavy casualties, losing 200,000 men, many of them their highest quality troops, while the Japanese lost 60,000. On the 8th of November, Chiang ordered his forces to retreat west towards the city of Nanking, the capital of China at the time. The Chinese in Nanking were positioned in elaborate fortifications inside and outside of the city. Despite these defenses, the Japanese captured the southern portion of the city by December 12th, which prompted Chiang to evacuate his troops from the city. The Japanese were frustrated after what they thought would be an easy victory. This frustration translated into brutality against civilians, many who were raped and executed on an immense scale. Estimates for the numbers of casualties ranges from 50,000 to 300,000. The massacre is probably the defining moment in the Second Sino-Japanese War and is possibly one of the single largest atrocities in human history. As such, the event remains one of the primary reasons why even today relations between Japan and China are at best somewhat bitter. By 1939, the war was beginning to reach a stalemate. The Chinese still refused to surrender despite huge casualties and territorial losses, and had begun to receive much-needed experience and foreign aid. Meanwhile, the Japanese lines of communication were being stretched to their limit, and Japanese forces had suffered substantial losses both in equipment and manpower. However, the Japanese spirits were lifted when their German allies signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, whom the Japanese feared would invade Manchuria and their holdings in northern China. On September the 14th, 13 days after Germany invaded Poland, a Japanese force of 100,000 men attacked the city of Changsha, which was the next major target on the road to Chongqing, where the Chinese government had been relocated. A force of 240,000 Chinese soldiers repelled them, inflicting more casualties than they had sustained. On October 6th, the Japanese withdrew and allowed the Chinese to regain lost ground in the surrounding areas. Changsha was the first major Japanese city that had managed to fight off the Japanese. While the Kuomintang tended to partake in sweeping operations, their communist allies in the north had mainly opposed the Japanese through insurgency and guerrilla tactics, but under pressure from Chiang Kai-shek, the Communist Party of China began to execute large offensive operations. On the 20th of August 1940, the CCP gathered 400,000 men of the 8th Route Army and assaulted numerous staging areas and railways, which are defended by 420 Japanese and collaborationist Chinese forces, and what would be called the 100 Regiments Offensive. Although the Japanese and collaborators pushed back the communists, they considered their campaign successful because it resulted in the destruction of about 600 miles of railroad tracks. The remainder of the Second Sino-Japanese War was marked by repeated failed attempts by the Japanese to take various strategic cities. It wasn't until near the end of the Second World War, when on the 9th of August 1945, 3 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and promptly destroyed the primary Japanese army in Manchuria. On the 15th of August, Japan surrendered, ending the Second Sino-Japanese War and ending the occupation of China. Within a year, the Chinese Civil War began again. Okay, so that was long and tedious, but it really wasn't. It was only 10 minutes of your lives. You'll get it back at some point in time. Tomorrow we're going to do some activities. Also, please note, I did all of the animations and cartoon drawings in that video by myself this afternoon after you guys left school, because I care for you. See you tomorrow.